Welcome, everyone. Let's get started for our afternoon plenary session today at the 2021 ACTC conference. I'm Charlie Thomas, and we have had a couple of fun-filled, jam-packed days of panels and plenaries, and we have a couple more left to go, but it's wonderful to see you here this afternoon. And I'm thrilled to welcome Marsaura Shukla to be our plenary speaker today, but I'm going to hand things over to a fellow board member for ACTC, Phil LeCure, to do the honors of introducing her to you. So Phil, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charlie. It's probably more of you know Marsaura than know me, so it's an exercise in inversion here, but I am very pleased to present to us Marsaura Shukla, a colleague of mine and a friend of mine from St. John's College out here in Santa Fe. Marsaura herself graduated from St. John's College in 1993. And on a path that led her through Fordham University and a master's degree in theology, she went further to the University of Chicago, and with the culmination of that degree work, ended up with a degree in theology from the University of Chicago. And the title of her thesis is Ortholexis, Reading in 20th Century Theology. And to me, that sounds scary. It's a scary word, ortholexis. It sounds like there might be a right way and a wrong way to do it. But she's not a scary person, at least in my experience with her. We shared a class together about 5 years ago. And as the year went along, I became more and more admiring and grateful for her clarity of mind and the grace with which she interacted with our students. I was looking over her list of publications, and I just want to mention two of them. One of them, most recent one, is Encountering Jesus, Schleiermacher Among the Historians. And then before that, Sylvan Historian, Time in Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. And I've just mentioned those two titles out of many to put a couple markers out for how diverse her interests are. And over the years, she's accumulated many honors and many scholarships, and we are fortunate to have her here to speak to us today. And she's going to speak to us about, as I understand it, Emily Dickinson. And I want to say one last thing before I retire from my introductory responsibilities here, which is not only has Marsaura done all these things I just mentioned and done them very impressively, but this is not the sort of thing that one usually says in an introduction, but she and her husband, Steve, have nourished and guided and shepherded two small children through what is used these last 14 months in Santa Fe, what is euphemistically called home sheltering. I think it's more like lockdown is a more accurate description of what we've all been through and the isolation that we've all been through. And I think that that is an astonishing feat to have accomplished under these circumstances. As I say, that's not particularly an academic credential, but I think it's a wonderful personal credential. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marsaura and be all ears for what she has to say to us about Emily Dickinson.
Thank you, Phil, for that very kind introduction. I'm gonna get my screen sharing going just because this kind of thing distracts me a lot, and I want to get it going before I start talking. Okay, can you all see that? Yeah. Okay. Cool. So I would like to dedicate my talk today to my friend and colleague, Carrie Stickney, who passed away last week. Our last conversation was about the old man in Chaucer's Pardoner's Tale who knocks on the earth asking to be let in. It was a moving conversation in which I found myself surprised by tears, while also, as always, learning from Carrie's reading of the text. I mention this because for me, the theme of crisis and consolation raises questions about the role of emotion in reading and thinking. What do we mean when we say a book comforts or consoles us in our sorrow? How does that happen? And what relationship does this consolation have to our thinking with and about texts? And this question about sorrow opens up into a larger question that has everything to do with liberal arts education, which is how do books transform us? What you know, we operate with this faith in, belief in, and I do believe it, that we are transformed by what we read. Well, how does that happen? I'm not going to return to that question, the larger one in the talk, but it is in the background of my thinking. So as a beginning to the question about consolation and how that happens, I want to look at a few of Emily Dickinson's poems about death and grief to see what they might teach us about specifically poetic consolation. The talk has three parts. I start by looking at one of Dickinson's letters of consolation. It ends with a poem, and comparing the poem with the prose of the letter helps sharpen the outlines of specifically poetic consolation. In the second part, I will turn to two poems that focus on the tomb, Safe in Their Alabaster Chambers and I Died for Beauty But Was Scarce. I will discuss how their presentation of what I call tomb life helps us understand the consoling power of the poetic. Finally, I turn to a poem from which the title of the talk comes, I Tried to Think a Lonelier Thing, a poem about an attempt at self-consolation. Thinking a Lonelier Thing, Emily Dickinson's Strategies of Consolation. Part 1, Consolation in Prose and Poetry. In January of 1863, Emily Dickinson wrote to her cousins, Frances and Louisa Norcross, upon the occasion of their father's death, a letter of consolation that ends with a poem. The poem is not one of her best, but the letter is a good place to start because it presses the question of the personal in any act of consolation. Dickinson speaks with intimacy to her cousins in the prose sections of the letter, offering her own home and parents to them to assuage the loss of theirs. This seems to me to show a crucial thing about everyday actual consolation, that it's strongly associated with physical intimacy. Think of consoling a child. You can't really do it without being in physical contact with them. While this may seem obvious, it does lead me to wonder again what we mean when we say books or poems console us. The heart of Dickinson's message of consolation to her cousins also invokes physical intimacy in the way she imagines her dead relatives. She writes, "Wasn't dear Papa so tired always after Mama went? And wasn't it almost sweet to think of them together these new winter nights? The grief is ours, darling. The glad is theirs." The idea that the dead are better off in a better place, resting from their labors with loved ones, is commonplace. It is this commonplace of consolation that Dickinson chooses to revisit after a fashion in the poem that ends the letter. So I'm gonna go to the poem. There we go. It is not dying hurts us so, 'tis living hurts us more. But dying is a different way, a kind behind the door. the southern custom of the bird that soon as frosts are due adopts a better latitude. We are the birds that stay, the shiverers round farmers' doors, for whose reluctant crumb we stipulate till pitying snows persuade our feathers home. In the prose of the letter, Dickinson sweetly thought the two dead parents together getting cozy on a winter night. In the poem, her business seems to be something steelier, dying, impersonalized in gerund form, with no particular subjects in view, is a different way, a kind behind the door. The imageless abstraction of those words ironically gets its imagistic correlate in the closed door behind which dying is. The metaphor of the southern custom of the bird doesn't do much to flesh out the abstractions and conveys more than anything absence. The gladness, the coziness invoked in the prose treatment of death gives way here to bracing poetic abstraction. One effect of Dickinson's bleeding the pathos out of her representation of death is to turn attention towards the more general problem of how living hurts us more. It is as if the pathos that might have been ascribed to death and dying were transferred to the description of living. We are shiverers round farmer's door, but the pathos is immediately undercut by the strangeness of stipulate, shivering, huddling, stipulating for a reluctant crumb. Life appears to be a struggle longer and more basic than any one moment of sharp grief. This movement of expansion outward doesn't stop there. The poem ends in the perspective of the pitying snows falling over the struggling birds. Its freezing effects cast as persuasion home. The image of falling snow covering what is alive and softening the transition between living and dying is the final moment of expansion in the poem. With its abstraction and expansion, the poem effects a withdrawal from the fraught personal particulars to higher mental ground. The sharp personal loss that grieves the Norcross cousins is folded into a meditation on both the utter strangeness and gentle inevitability of death for all who are alive. The speculative distance created in the poem suggests a different sort of consolation. The temptation at this point might be to understand the mechanism of this consolation as one in which reason offers a vision of how things that are challenges in terms of, sentence that is not making sense. The temptation at this point might be to understand the mechanism of this consolation as one in which reason offers a vision of how things are that challenges the terms of the experience of pain. Such, it seems to me, is the kind of consolation offered, at least on one level, by Lucretius in The Nature of Things. We might argue that such a turn to the life of the mind is the consolation offered by philosophy more generally, especially in the Neoplatonic tradition, exemplified in Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy, for example. There is undeniably an element of something like this in the poem to the Norcross cousins, with the speculative distance it achieves from personal sorrow. And I do think that speculative distance plays a key role in any consolation and in poetic consolation. I want to try to show, though, that in her greatest poems of consolation, Dickinson's way is different from this. We do find in them speculation, expansion, and abstraction, but of a different kind. Her way, furthermore, seems to me to differ importantly from the way of philosophy in focusing on keeping thinking and emotion together. I turn now to two well-known poems that may seem unlikely candidates for poems of consolation: Safe in Their Alabaster Chambers and I Died for Beauty But Was Scarce. In both, Dickinson consoles soothes our fundamental anxiety and sorrow at the prospect of death by introducing us not to the life of the mind, but to the life of the tomb. Part 2, tomb life. I will begin with safe in their alabaster chambers. So let me. Safe in their alabaster chambers, untouched by morning and untouched by noon, sleep the meek members of the resurrection, rafters of satin and roof of stone. Grand go the years and the crescent above them, worlds scoop their arcs and firmaments row, diadems drop and doges surrender, soundless as dots on a disk of snow. The first stanza is built on the traditional Christian teaching that the dead will rise in the general resurrection, and the reference to dying as sleeping that arises out of that teaching. The focus of the traditional teaching is on the glorious endpoint, sometime in the future. Dickinson zeroes in on the time in between and lets us, her readers, become the companions of the entombed. The tomb is oddly domesticated. It is a safe chamber. It has rafters and a roof. But the domestication only goes so far. Alabaster, satin, and stone remind us that something far paler and more still and colder than life as we know it is going on here. Yet by casting the tomb as a house with folks sleeping in it, Dickinson is insisting that her readers be in analogical contact with the entombed. The world of the tomb is characterized by a profound stasis. Dickinson introduces stasis by juxtaposing it with change. Somewhere, morning turns to noon, but those in the alabaster chamber remain untouched. Yet, given the element of cozy domestication, the stasis has at least some connection to a delicious Sunday sleep-in. There's an ambiguity of tone. This same juxtaposition organizes the second stanza. Zooming out from the span of a day, Dickinson offers a grand vision of cosmic and epical movement. But all the movement ends up soundless as dots on a disk of snow. This mildly synesthesial image of white silence makes clear that the perspective that dominates the poem is the perspective from within the tomb. This perspective is even clear in the descriptions of movement, the crescent traversed by the years, the arcs, the world's scoop, are hemispheric views of the cosmos from the tomb as the speaker looks upward. In the poem to the Norcross cousins, Dickinson moved her readers away from personal sorrow towards acknowledgement of death's mystery and inevitability through the strategies of abstraction and expansion. Here, that abstraction and expansion are present more as characteristics of the tomb perspective that Dickinson is cultivating and inviting her readers to share. The vantage point of meek members of the resurrection is one that is at a remove from the quick world of timely and dramatic action. The poem presents that world as sweeping unnoticed across the visual hemisphere of the entombed sleeper. The slowness and silence of the tomb allows for a holistic vision of the quick world above that is similar to the expansion out into the pitying snow in the Consolation letter poem. But the vantage point from which the sweep of cosmic and historical action is available is also a place of profound abstraction in the sense that word has of detachment, where all the grand action registers as soundless as dots on a disk of snow. How does this poem console? To be sure, there is within the alabaster chamber something of that same speculative distance from the vicissitudes of life and death characteristic of the consolations of philosophy. But I want to highlight the consolatory work done by the image world of the poem, by the imaginative act it invites of taking on the perspective of the dead. Through this, the poem allows for an experience, a momentary and refined one, of the boundary between the living and the dead. In the last poem we considered, The dead figured as migrating birds are wholly elsewhere. In this poem, the space of the tomb and the world of the living are vividly present simultaneously, but only in contact through the reader taking on the tomb perspective, and so registering how the world fails to be perceived in the silent whiteness of death. Dickinson's careful presentation of the non-appearance of the world is itself an image of our fear and sorrow about the loss of the world of movement and light in death. This image is one in which we can feel a version of our fear and sorrow, a version that does not sweep away thought, but rather informs and is informed by thought. This sort of bringing together of emotion and thought is, I think, essential to poetic consolation. There are a few poems in which Dickinson takes the consolatory exploration of life after death even further by crafting a speaker who is dead. Woody Allen famously said, "It's not that I'm afraid to die. I just don't want to be there when it happens. Death is at least the cessation of the self as we know it, and is perhaps the cessation of the self completely. But as our ways of talking suggest, we cannot but think of it as a state attributed to a person. She was alive and now she is dead. This way of talking suggests that the transition between life and death is an experience that we undergo." Dickinson is particularly attuned to the anxiety about being there when it happens. One poem in which Dickinson seems to be focusing quite pointedly on the strangeness of being there when it happens is "I heard a fly buzz when I died." I want to turn to another example in the subset of death poems in Dickinson's work, which, like Safe in Their Alabaster Chambers, centers on the space of the tomb. Let me go to the next. "I died for beauty, but was scarce adjusted in the tomb, when one who died for truth was lain in an adjoining room. He questioned softly why I failed for beauty, I replied, and I for truth, themself are one. We brethren are, he said. And so as kinsmen met a night, we talked between the rooms until the moss had reached our lips and covered up our names." If Safe in Their Alabaster Chambers configures the problem of dying through juxtaposing the abstract stillness of the tomb and the exterior world of cosmological and historical time, this poem centers on the problem of death in relation to our individual interior histories and worlds. The whole poem, it seems to me, is an experiment with thinking about the nature of the dead self. Being dead is represented as an ongoing quasi-historical process, discontinuous with, and yet wholly unrelated to, and yet wholly not unrelated to, not wholly unrelated to one's individual history while alive. It's early in the speaker's death life that the events described in the poem occur. The speaker is scarce adjusted in the tomb when her neighbor is lain in the adjoining room, and the conversation between them continues until the moss does its work. When and until define a span of time for the action. Nor is it clear when in time the speaker is, given that the poem is retrospective. A similar indeterminacy of time seems to be one of the explicit concerns of Because I Could Not Stop for Death, another one of Dickinson's death poems. That the speaker is adjusted in the tomb and the neighbor lain suggests the passivity of dead bodies, yet the selves in question are speaking, offering accounts of themselves, Indeed, the poem has an unusual amount of reported speech, complete with quotation marks. These two are most definitely there when it happens, to use Woody Allen's language. The poem is structured by oppositions, and the oppositions between inert bodies and active speech is the first of them. The second opposition worth considering is the one between the abstract and the concrete. The abstract nouns beauty and truth reverberate through the first two stanzas, and they, and the conception of life and death as being for them, are in some tension, perhaps even comedic tension, with blunt and businesslike adjusted and adjoining, words that point to the physical reality of the graveyard as close set rows of bodies packed into small boxes. The comedic aspect of the tension is heightened by the euphemistic turn of phrase with which Dead Person 2 asks why Dead Person 1 failed. Your more refined tomb folk, it seems, abstain from the D word. Yet this refinement contrasts with the bluntness of the first two words, I died. But the slight absurdity of the polite and friendly conversation is an undercurrent over which the more serious strangeness of our connection to the highest ideals is juxtaposed with the starkness of our inevitable end. The inertness of bodies in the tomb, first introduced with the word adjusted, comes to the fore in the movement of the moss over the bodies of the speakers towards their lips. While the sight, common to any graveyard, of moss obscuring names on gravestones might be behind the final lines of these poems, it would be an unwarranted normalization of the strangeness of these lines, not to note that names could also refer to beauty and truth, the abstract names given to their histories, reasons, causes by these two kinsmen met a night. The surprising juxtaposition is between lips and names. As moss reaches lips, names are covered up. We tend to think of names as more permanent than our uttering of them. But here Dickinson makes us wonder about that. When the moss has reached our lips, what becomes of all our naming, of our account giving? This is best heard not as a rhetorical question posed to cast doubt on the reality of meaning and account giving, but as a real problem within which Dickinson wants us to dwell. The concrete world of which we, with our adjustable bodies and coverable lips, are part is one of entropy. But the world of meaning within which we live our intellectual, linguistic, and social lives operates on a principle different from that. Dickinson's presentation of tomb life in I Died for Beauty But Was Scarce shows death to be the point of highest tension between these two worlds. She does this by fashioning the tomb as a space in which the concrete and non-concrete are starkly juxtaposed. Inert bodies with lively speech, and within the speech itself, the further euphemistic turn away from concreteness with the substitution of failed for died. These juxtapositions happen in what you might call the plot of the poem. In the language of the poem, abstract nouns like beauty and truth sit next to adjusted and adjoining, bland words that evoke the facticity of the concrete world. The problem Dickinson wants to show us most succinctly put before us in the placement of our lips next to our names at the endings of the last two lines. In now trying to say how the presentation of this problem can be consolation, I find myself drawn again to the sense that I Died for Beauty But Was Scarce offers a kind of mirror experience. To the extent that the tension between the world of meaning and the entropic world of bodily life roots our anxiety and sorrow in the face of death, it is indeed a consolation to grapple with it within the otherness of this strange poem. Beauty and truth, as a possible opposed pair asserted in a nod to Keats to be one in the middle of the poem, indeed become one under the umbrella of our names and under the covering of moss. The moss, like the snow in the poem with which we began, softens the tension between the concrete and the abstract without, it seems to me, resolving it. The poem in its entirety renders, in a few senses of the word, our fear of loss of self in death. It is a rendering as in a picture. It also furnishes us with a version of our fear, renders it to us for our experience and contemplation. Finally, and most tentatively, it melts the coagulated character that attends unspoken fear. Part 3, thinking and consolation. I want to end by turning far too briefly to a poem that stands out as strange and difficult, even within Dickinson's always challenging body of work. I have been talking about consolation, but not much about crisis. The poem I'm about to read is spoken in the voice of crisis and talks about the search, perhaps not wholly successful, for consolation. In its depiction of crisis-seeking consolation, the poem underscores two elements central to the poetic consolation I see in the Tomb Life poems. The first is the inseparability in poetic consolation of thinking and feeling. The second is the efficacy or even necessity of a figure or image of the self in pain. I tried to think a lonelier thing than any I had seen, some polar expiation, an omen in the bone of death's tremendous nearness. I probed retrieveless things my duplicate to borrow. A haggard comfort springs from the belief that somewhere within the clutch of thought, there dwells one other creature of heavenly love forgot. I plucked at our partition as one should pry the walls between himself and horror's twin within opposing cells. I almost strove to clasp his hand, such luxury it grew, that as myself could pity him, perhaps he pitied me. I divide the poem into two parts. The first stanza describes what seems to be an intellectual experiment. The four following stanzas re-describe the experiment and reveal it to be an attempt at consolation. The first description pairs thinking with loneliness, expiation, and omen in a way that blurs the boundaries between intellectual activity and emotional, psychological, and physical states. I tried to think a lonelier thing than any I had seen. This attempt, this trying to think, is one that brings thinking and feeling into close proximity because the object of thought remains unspecified. It is a thing. Its surpassing loneliness defines it. But loneliness, generally speaking, is felt, not thought. That the attempt aims beyond what is seen, links the thinking to imagination, but then this word, strangely capitalized, thing, is an obstacle to substituting imagination for thinking. You can't actually imagine, that is, conjure a mental image of thing. The final two lines of the stanza rename the thing of line 1. Some polar expiation. Some picks up on the indeterminacy of a thing, while polar, with its associations of vast icy wastes beyond civilization, echoes lonelier. But what about expiation? Expiation seems to name not the object of the attempt at thinking, but the effect of the attempt. To say that a lonelier thing, if successfully thought, would be an expiation is to bind thinking with the psychological, spiritual, and perhaps even physical arc of guilt, suffering, and redemption. If expiation suggests a kind of retrospective purpose, a reckoning with the weight of the past, then an omen in the bone points to some sort of grasp of the future, a grasp experienced bodily in the bone. This again, not precisely naming the object of thought, but its significance for the thinker. An omen in the bone of death's tremendous nearness. Though felt in the bone, this is not simply a feeling, but, as the word omen suggests, a kind of insight or discernment into a situation. This is a feeling that is also thinking. The second part of the poem is characterized by the substitution of several tactile verbs for the austere tried to think of the first stanza. I probed, I plucked, I almost strove to clasp. These physical actions are tentative and incomplete, and this ties them to the language of attempt in the first stanza. But the lonelier thing, promising the retrospective and prospective grasp of expiation and omen, has a strange counterpart here in the figure of the duplicate, the one other, the twin. It seems to me that the first two lines of the second stanza offer a kind of bridge between the two parts of the poem. I probed retrieveless things, my duplicate to borrow. This repetition of things and the similarity of retrieveless to lonelier suggest that probing retrieveless things is something like trying to think a lonelier thing. But now the thing, lonelier, retrieveless, is revealed as the duplicate of the speaker. This doubleness and the attempt to reach the double then becomes the main concern of the poem. In this seeking of the double or the image of the self, the sense of crisis only suggested in the expiation and omen of stanza 1 becomes sharp. In this crisis, a haggard comfort springs from the belief that somewhere within the clutch of thought, there dwells one other creature of heavenly love forgot. The comfort is haggard and the thought clutches, both images that suggest the desperation and fatigue of long suffered sorrow. As the sense of crisis rises, the lonelier, polar, retrieveless thing becomes the less evocative, but much more clearly abject, other creature of heavenly love forgot. The voice of real crisis continues in the final two stanzas. The penultimate stanza reads a little like a Gothic version of I died for beauty but was scarce, with silent plucking at the partition between opposing cells to get to horror's twin, instead of conversation between kinsmen in adjoining rooms, perhaps about beauty and truth. This is a picture of what crisis thinking might look like, not linear, but iterative and tentative, not able to seek more than an image of its own pain. The final stanza surprises. Though still tentative and incomplete, the movement of thought here seems to go beyond the haggard comfort of the middle of the poem to the luxury of pity. It is finally the emotional possibility, mutual pity, that introduces into this search for consolation in crisis a note of real relief. But we cannot forget that this is an emotional possibility opened up by an other that is also the same, a twin or image, caught in the clutch of thought. As I was finishing this talk late last night, I really questioned the wisdom of ending with this strange poem. It's not a poem that offers consolation, like Safe in Their Alabaster Chambers or I Died for Beauty but Was Scarce. It is not an example of poetic consolation, but in what it shows about the intertwining of thinking and feeling and the pointed need for a twin to our horror. It sheds light on the particular character of poetic consolation, at least in Dickinson's version of it. Dickinson's poetry offers consolation by giving our thought an image of our sorrow and our fear. Thanks.
Thanks, Marsaura. Join me in thanking her. Okay, great. Maybe you should unshare the screen. Oh,
yeah.
Please go ahead.
No, I was just saying, should I stop? I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, I should unshare the screen so we can go back to the gallery mode, and I will field questions. And I think we can do this pretty informally since we fit on a screen. So if you have a question for Marsaura, just raise your actual hand, and I will acknowledge you to ask a question. I'm actually going to start because I can, and nobody's jumping in before I have a chance to abuse my power. So one of the things because I do ancient Greek stuff, right? I know you're immersed in that. Lots of your colleagues do too. But one of the things that that happened in Athens that I don't think in the classical period, archaic period to some extent too, that we don't talk about as much as we should when we're doing Greek philosophy and tragedy literature generally, is the mysteries, right? The Eleusinian mysteries. And because it was culturally such a big deal. I'm sure Mary knows 17 times as much about this as I do. But and what we know of the mysteries, and this actually plays out in some other things, other practices that were less widespread than the Eleusinian mysteries, but is that they are a kind of ritual of facing death, that there's a sort of a moment where your death is staged, perhaps. Most of what we know, I think we know from art. There's some narrative accounts, but mostly there's, we have sort of images of what this might have been like. And this was supposed to be a liberating experience. At this point, it's all speculative, right? But as you speculate on the ritual and on its place in Athenian society, because it was so widespread. I mean, so many Athenian citizens were initiated. This idea that somehow not just sort of acknowledging your mortality, but actually going through something where you prepared yourself in various ways for an incredibly intense experience of practicing your own death, that put you into life in a different way, that it made certain things possible about your comportment to life that perhaps weren't possible, or that they believed anyway, without that moment. And I was so, this is my own set of associations firing off in my mind as you're working on Dickinson, but I wonder how that fits with this sort of consolation of the tomb. And I guess I'll go to this last poem that you brought up, because I mean, this word luxury she uses in the last stanza of the last poem, right? I almost strove to clasp his hand. I'm interested in the its and hises in this poem too, but I almost strove to clasp his hand. Such luxury it grew, that my, and my language is here, but this idea that this possibility of connection or pity between them, that there's a luxury somehow in repositioning yourself to your own death, or making friends with your own death, or somehow experiencing your own death. And Was that a question? I don't know. I'm just wondering what you think about all
No,
of
I mean, that's really interesting. The thing that that's clearly what she's saying in that last stanza, that somehow, I mean, I wonder how pity is working in it, but that somehow facing your other in abjection, at least, and maybe in death, is some form of luxury. It's some form of release, or I'm not sure how to understand luxury. But the thing that I was thinking as you were talking about the mysteries themselves, and I wasn't thinking about them, but in relation to Emily Dickinson, is it sharpens for me the question of what a poem is, because you're talking about ritual. So you're talking about bodily enactment that I'm imagining is understood to kind of evoke emotion. It's an experience, right? You have to do it physically. You prepare. And while I was writing this, I was also thinking of monks sleeping in their coffins, it's more than a memento mori. It's not just that. It's taking on the perspective somehow of this other place or this other state, right? But then the question, I mean, so I guess what I wonder is, and this gets back to this question about reading, what's the relationship of reading a poem to doing a ritual? How do you I mean, I feel like there is a relationship. I feel like I read this luxurious pity between the two twins, and I'm somehow there. But I'm not there in the same way that I am in a ritual. Just like a ritual is not exactly the same as dying. They're all sort of these related images of each other. And it's a real mystery to me how we become the thing in a ritual, or become the being talked about in the poem,
No, that's a really compelling mystery, especially given Dickinson's solitude, right? So
Yeah.
what she wasn't, forget sort of these intense, unusual, to us remarkably alien kind of practices. She wasn't even participating in the everyday.
No.
The way that even in lockdown or whatever, the Santa Fe shelter, I mean, she wasn't engaged in life even to that extent, probably. So
Right.
whatever she was doing had to be on this other kind of way.
Exactly. And I think I think you might say that she was a true adept at that kind of movement, sort of because of her isolation. I mean, she's it seems to me that the character of her poetry, all of it, it's sort of, it's concentratedness comes from this ability to really hone in on what it is that will make a person become the being in the poem.
I'm going to abuse my power for one more follow-up, and then I promise I'll make room for everyone else. Do you think, and I'll expand on this a little bit, but my question, this one is a focus question. Do you think she terrifies herself? In some of these other rituals, that the mysteries probably, but there's another one that I won't get into detail, but the whole cave of Trophonius, and it's just the most fabulous and crazy stuff. But being terrified is an essential part of the ritual. It's not, they even, give you certain drugs to amplify the terror that you experience. And it's not accidental. It's not, some people get it and some don't. If you have to have the terror, if the ritual is going to be what it's supposed to be. And the thing about terror is that obviously somebody can terrify you by, in the case of Trophonius, floating into a cave, and doing scary things. But you can terrify yourself sitting all alone at home. And my understanding is the body chemistry is actually the same,
Agreed.
you know, that it's so I wonder if one way into this question about how is it the books or how is it the poetry does these things that we think about associated with ritual and other things is that right that there's a kind of if part of what Dickinson is doing or encouraging us to do is put ourselves in these situations to the point where they really where it's terrifying or has some other intense emotional quality.
Right.
Maybe that is an experience to be taken seriously as an experience.
I mean, I think that's right. I think that might that might be a way to talk about great or successful poems that somehow she is, and when I say call her an adept, she is able to say, okay, what word is it here that I can feel the kind of chill up my spine as I write it, and I know it will affect this thing in my reader, right? It kind of, and I mean, I don't like, I'm of two minds about it, because a lot of Dickinson scholarship kind of talks about her as writing out of, like, right from extreme pain and suffering. And I think I prefer to think of her in this language of being an adept, being able to invoke the experience in a way that's about art and not just sort of confessional, not just, she's sad, so she writes about sadness, and you might get sad when you read it. That it's but something more orchestrated. But I think that's right. She's got to rely on this sort of, I don't even know what to call it. It's like a malleability of being, right? That you can, I mean, what is it? How do we terrify ourselves? That it's strange, right? But I think that's right. That openness to kind of, has got to be part of it. Oh, go ahead, Miss Laws.
Oh, sorry, Paige. I was acknowledging you and I was muted.
Sorry.
So I'm very sorry, Paige.
It's okay. I very interestingly to me, I didn't have this thought until your whole talk was over. And I think it's significant that I didn't have the thought about Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, until it was all over. And then I thought, because it's an obvious, anything with tombs and premature death and intimation of death and all those, but they seem to be, and also following on your conversation with Charlie, I mean, the Dickinson seems so infinitely more cerebral somehow than Poe. And it's not that I'm poo-pooing Poe. I think he's great at what he does. But it's such a different process. And both, I think, can create the frisson, whatever the French would say, but they're so different. And I'm trying to figure out why and how and why.
No, I think that's a great line of inquiry. I've been thinking about Poe too, primarily in terms of this. I mean, I'm really interested in Dickinson's reenactments of life in the tomb. This idea that there's something to be gained by imagining different forms of tomb life, and Poe too has this fixation with, well, what if the person in the tomb is not dead,
Yeah.
right? What happens then, right? But it does seem to me that with Dickinson, the process of thought is further along. It seems to me that she is, like in this last poem I read, when I read her saying, I plucked at our partition as one should pry the walls between himself and horror's twin within opposing cells. I thought of Poe when I was writing about that. And I thought, in a certain sense, what Poe does is give us horror's twin in the opposing cell. There is the person dead and not dead, enclosed, some version of ourselves, right? Some version of ourselves, not just because, I mean, I think there's some weird facts about more people than we know being buried alive at the time. but anyway, I mean, I think it's not just that, but more this sort of sense of, I am conscious, and at some point I will not be conscious, and so there's a magnetism for me with this thought of being alive in so he gives us horror's twin, but Dickinson is giving us the plucking away at it. Dickinson is giving us the sort of, what is to be gained, what's the larger problem and the larger situation of the conscious thinker facing that, going for it, recognizing it as same and different, and somehow gaining purchase on it. I mean, it seems to me that that's more what she's after in her presentation of tomb life, so it's so there's something terrifying. There is, as you say, it's still the razzle dazzle of fear there, right? But I avoid talking French. But there is, in addition to that, I think this thing that I and this is just a straw man, but talk about a speculative distance. There's a kind of, and that's why the tomb life poems, not the final one, which is a poem of pain, but the other ones are, there's a preternatural calmness to them, and I think that that's about creating space for a kind of comprehension or speculation of this horror.
Sort of a rarefication.
Yeah.
Being rarefied.
Right.
And
Keep going.
But it definitely seems to have required more thought.
Right. No, I think that's right.
More thought has gone into Emily Dickinson.
Right. No, I think that's right. But then again, I mean, and that's why I'm sort of interested in, I don't think it's thought as opposed to the visceral reactions. It seems to me a kind of visceral thinking. The rarefication is there, but it's not in the direction of a kind of division. It's sort of, it really is a taking up of the visceral into this rarefied, zone.
It seems to me that that's absolutely on target, because I mean, Poe uses in a different way, but he uses the conventional language of the Gothic horror,
right?
To create these scenarios, and somehow Emily Dickinson has gotten where she doesn't need that.
Right.
She can do with a few words what Poe has to do with a whole lot. And it's just remarkable to me how powerful that is. That, and the rarefication seems like a really good way of putting it. It's a distillation, it's a purification of, without losing any of the components.
That's right. That's right. No, I think that's right. And I and I'm going back to Charlie's comments, thinking about it as a ritual space somehow, so that she, because it's also because the lines are so short, and I mean she's forcing you to see things just as she wants you to see them, that you fall into her rhythm, you you're hit with what she chooses to capitalize and what she doesn't. You're not in the space of normal language, as you say. You're really not in the space of normal language. You're in the space of her language. And so I feel like that's related to this kind of orchestration, you know, this making a space so that you can achieve a certain state of thought and feeling combined.
Marsaura, I want to ask you about something you just said about the rhythm, and the way I would bring the question up is in the talk, which I thought was quite wonderful. What I mostly got from it as I was listening to it was a sense of the development of an image and the intricate relationship of two different fields of diction, if I could put it that way. The palpable sensory diction and the abstract diction, and holding those together in an image. But what I wanted to ask you about, granted all of that and gratefully granted all of that, I wanted to ask you about rhythm. She has, in many poems, to where you could say, oh, that's an Emily Dickinson poem, just like you could say, oh, that's a Mozart composition when you hear something on the radio. A 4/3 rhythm. There's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, because I could not stop for death, it kindly stopped for me. It's an ancient form. You know, but I wondered particularly that particular rhythm, which is, I would say, her hallmark, how that contributes to the sense of consolation. One of the lines that has always been in my mind and is after great pain, a formal feeling comes. And so I'm asking about the formal feeling,
Right.
not just the feeling.
Right. And formal in the sense of form rather than, you know, yeah. No, I think that's a really good question. I'm not sure how to understand how she uses rhythm, because I find in examples of people reading her poetry, or there's a sense in which her use of hymn rhythm can lead to a sort of not quite seeing the seriousness of her poetry, because it's sort of like da 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 da, you know. It's a rhythm that can be misinterpreted. I think she uses it in order to sort of I don't know. I sometimes, if it seems to me like it might be in ironic relationship to her kind of cerebral refinement, so that she's taking a very conventional form, right? Her rhythm is conventional, and it gives her room to be unconventional in other ways, in punctuation, in the dashes, in where sentences stop and start or aren't sentences at all. Or so, I mean, that's as far as I can go. But Phil, if you've been thinking about Emily Dickinson too, so tell me what you think about her rhythm, because it's a real, I really wonder about it. I feel like I'm not a good listener.
Well, you talked about expansion, conceptual expansion, the expansion of the image, particularly in the first poem that you were discussing. And in counterpoint to that, I would see her rhythm as a contracting rhythm. It's a 4 to a 3. To quote some non-Emily Dickinson poems using the same rhythm in the same way that she does.
Mhm.
The medieval poem, "O Western Wind, when wilt thou blow, that the small rain down can rain." That poem is 4/3. Or
Mhm.
Wordsworth's "Slumber did my spirit seal, I had no human fears."
Mhm.
That's that poem, and it's a very simple rhythmic strategy, but it's not trite.
Mhm.
And in that sense, I would hesitate about placing it in an ironic
Okay.
relationship to her conceptual
Okay.
strengths, but
Okay.
more in some kind of a telling counterpoint.
No, that's helpful. And as you were talking, I like the thought of contraction, because I feel like this is very characteristic of Emily Dickinson. She does not, like, as opposed to maybe a Shakespeare sonnet, she doesn't rise to a resounding ending. She tends to quiesce at the end of her poems. There tends to be a sort of, she'll recede and just kind of leave you with it. And it seems to me that the 4/3 rhythm might lend itself to that, to this kind of creating space for the things in the poem to just sort of,
And there's always as it were, the empty fourth beat
right,
in second line.
right,
And still the pensive spring returns, and still the punctual snow.
right,
And then there's another shoe to drop, but
right.
it doesn't drop in the poem.
Yeah, that's actually very helpful. Yes.
I think Mary Townsend's been trying to get in on this, so let me see if I can get her in.
Oh yes, no, this talk was wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
I don't think I would have made the connection between these tomb thoughts and consolation, so I'm really grateful for that. I thought that during the Poe discussion here, maybe something you said about the loss of self can sort of explain, like, Poe, like, you're locked in the chamber, you're alive, and so in the tomb you still retain yourself, which is the horror. So
Right.
maybe one of the things that Dickinson is doing is sort of allowing that horrifying moment of still being alive in death to sort of recede. I have to admit, this sort of reminded me of a nightmare that I often have. Sort of like, you're just by the beach and the sea is somehow infinite, and you just feel the infinity of the sea stretching off, and just the horror of the contrast between you, the finite self, and infinite distance. But I wonder if that's sort of the same thing. Like, I'm still by the sea, whereas if I could turn my name into moss, or if I could sort of focus on a disk of snow, then I've moved on, and I'm not in a nightmare anymore. So it seems like maybe the dream versus a poem, maybe that's the difference. In a dream, I can't leave the self behind quite, but a poem really allows me to do that in some way, maybe because of how images work. But now I feel busy.
Yeah, I think that is one of the functions of the expansion I was talking about. This kind of, so she'll put you there, and then somehow you're split. You're there, but you're also expanding out. And so that, right, gets you out of Poe's sort of endpoint of horror. Right, there you are. And that seems to be what he's interested in. That situation of horror, right? And I mean, I think as we've said, she's interested in something more. She wants to build on that, or yeah.
Is there something heartbeat like to the meter? Da, 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 da,
Interesting.
da, da. I mean, it's almost as if the poem gets into rhythm with our bodies.
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, it is a hymn rhythm, and I think that must have developed as some sort of a dun dun dun, right? Yeah. Although I guess the heartbeat wouldn't define the number of feet per line, right? Because the heartbeat just goes on and on. So, right. But the, yeah, the regularity of it.
We probably have, I don't know, time for a couple of more, 10 minutes left.
I think Mr. Fisher.
Oh, good. Norm, please.
Hey, Marsaura, it was a really great paper. I just couldn't help when you were looking at those, especially those last two poems. I had these religious thoughts, I guess, and especially, I mean, just let me mention too, uh, where beauty and truth are united in death. That just seems like Hades or the beatific vision, right? Or any of these things that you might think about, right? And then the other thing was that this twin, and now I can't remember Dickinson's exact words, but it's endless love, or what is that? In
Endless. Oh, heavenly love.
heavenly love, right? And I thought, oh, so this is the twin is me, but redeemed, right? And so I'm and so in the tomb, right, that would be the place where those two things would, I guess, meet, right? Or are scratching at each other, as you put it, right? Or scratching towards each other. And so I thought, if you had any thoughts about I guess the religious aspects of these poems.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that it's significant, and this is why I'm so interested in where she wants to locate, sort of focus her attention in the tomb life poems. It's interesting to me that she does not want to imaginatively place us in heaven or hell, but in an in-between place, right? Like, so the lines you're thinking of, the speaker and the speaker's twin are both forgotten by heavenly love. So, you know, it's like it's not this kind of cosmology, the traditional cosmology is in the background, meek members of the resurrection. It's not discounted somehow. And yet she seems to be zeroing in on a place that's forgotten by tradition too, right? That this in between, this kind of this space of being dead but being on earth and be, you know, I'm reading Carolyn Walker Bynum has a book on just various understandings of what happens to bodies and how do they come back together in the resurrection if they're, you know, they've rot and they, you know, so how like what are the mechanisms in the early church and the medieval theologians? How are they understood to how do you reconstitute dead bodies, right? And she seems to be kind of interested in that middle place, in that waiting ground, in that. So it's and I'm still in the process. I think this is a good question. I'm still in the process of figuring out why she wants to do that. What's at stake for her in drawing out the implications of the traditional cosmology for the middle place, the middle time. What, you know, what is, and it's, I mean, I think she's thinking about the nature of that cosmology and the nature of belief in that cosmology, and kind of working something out in a, you know, with all of her poems about this stuff, working something out, but I haven't quite figured it out yet. Good
Josh
question.
is next, but let me just on that point, I was immediately, and I thought it was just because I reread the novel recently, but I was immediately in George Saunders' Bardo, right? I was in Lincoln in the Bardo. I was in the in-between.
I haven't read that yet. I really want to.
Oh, it's a polarizing book, but I'm a big fan. But it's in that space that you're talking about. That is the Bardo, right? It's in space, and especially in the image in the second poem where the moss is covering the lips. This sense that even in this moment after death, there's still something happening. There's still transition. There's still a mystery to what comes after. Yeah. So sorry, Josh. It's you.
So is Consolation for Emily Dickinson identical with acceptance?
That's interesting. I see her as far too critical and restless a thinker to say that she's, she is not, I don't know. Yeah, no, I would say Consolation is, and it's funny to say this about somebody who was so isolated. Consolation is companionship. It's being with, so that maybe that's a form of acceptance, but it's not a form of acceptance that's about moving on. It's a form of acceptance that's about dwelling in it, I don't, yeah, it seems to me, why am I resisting the thought that it would be accepted? I think it's because she seems to have so much energy for creating the ins and outs of this situation and inviting us in and wanting us to be there in it. That it's more than simply acceptance, because that would suggest that you've gained purchase on it and you're just kind of, it's thinking. I think Consolation in a certain sense is a form of felt thinking and dwelling. And so that's what she tries to do. Okay.
Such a rich conversation. Yeah. Anyone else like to, we probably have a minute left, 5 perhaps. But I don't know.
Well, thank you all. It's been great to talk about it, and I appreciate your attention.
It was really wonderful talk, Marsaura. Thank you so much. We have a lot of conference left, everyone. So there's another few sessions tonight, lots and lots going on tomorrow and Friday. So I hope to see you in other rooms in the next few days, but I don't know whether any of them will be quite as fabulous and lovely as this one. This was just great, Marsaura. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks everybody for coming. Bye.